In October of 1955, a 23-year-old dental student climbed into a green race car he had never driven on a track he had learned that weekend from the back of a rented scooter. Waiting for him was the factory Maserati team on their home turf in Sicily, driving the fastest Grand Prix cars on Earth. Everyone at the track expected the little British car to break down or finish last. Instead, it won. It was the first time a British car had beaten Europe's best in over 30 years, and almost nobody remembers it today. This is the story of the Connaught Type B, the forgotten car that quietly started the British takeover of Formula One. We are counting down from number 10, and number 1 is the part the official record books still refuse to acknowledge. Let us get into it. Number 10. The car came out of a garage that made its money selling other people's racing cars. Before there was ever a Connaught factory, two former wartime airmen named Rodney Clark and Mike Oliver ran a small shop in Send a Quiet Village in Surrey. They called it Continental Cars, making a living buying, selling, and tuning exotic machines from Europe, mostly Bugattis and Maseratis. Then the supply dried up. Bugatti stopped making cars after the war, and the two airmen made a decision that sounded almost crazy for a tiny rural workshop. If they could no longer sell other people's racing cars, they would build their own. They needed serious backing to do it, and they found it in a young man named Kenneth McAlpine, heir to a massive British construction fortune. McAlpine brought them a car to service, left highly impressed by the quality of their work, and agreed to fund the whole project. Their first creation was not a Grand Prix car at all. It was a neat little sports car built on a Lee Francis frame, and it sold well enough to keep them going. By the early 1950s, they were building single-seater Formula 2 cars, and when the World Championship briefly ran under Formula 2 rules, Connaught suddenly found itself competing in Grand Prix racing, even handing early drives to future legends like Sterling Moss and Mike Hawthorne. They were never a serious threat to the Italian giants. They were just the plucky locals filling out the grid. What they lacked in budget, they made up for in engineering instinct, that quiet, clever problem-solving natural to two men who had spent they were working on military aircraft. The name they picked was a quiet little joke Connaught, spun from the sound of the words Continental Auto. From a borrowed sports car frame and sheer guts, a Grand Prix team was born in a place no one in Italy had ever heard of. That absolute obscurity is the main reason why what came next was impossible to predict. Number 9. The car that won the race was never meant to be the real contender. When the new 2.5-liter rules arrived for Formula One, Clark had a grand plan, and it was ambitious. He envisioned a streamlined machine built around a brand new V8 engine from Coventry Climax with a radical rear-engine layout to follow. It was precisely the kind of forward-thinking design that would later define British motorsport. But there was a catch. The engine never arrived. Coventry Climax backed out of the project, leaving Connaught left scrambling with absolutely nothing to put on the starting grid. So they fell back on what they had, an older 4-cylinder engine from a small firm called Alta, rooted in Formula 2. They bored it out to 2.5 liters, squeezed 240 horsepower from it, and bolted it into a basic frame of large diameter tubing using a de Dion rear axle and a pre-selector gearbox to get power to the ground. Finally, they wrapped the chassis in a smooth, streamlined body that earned it a classic nickname, the toothpaste tube. The result was the Type B. It was built strictly as a stopgap, a placeholder to keep clients and mechanics busy until the proper car arrived. But the proper car never showed. This temporary compromise, a machine nobody took pride in, was the one that made history. There is a clear lesson in that about what truly wins races. It is rarely the perfect plan. What the Type B did possess, however, was great balance and clever design. It was light on its feet, beautifully crafted and engineered to preserve its tires and brakes over a grueling Grand Prix distance. While the Italian teams chased raw horsepower, Connaught focused on finesse. Yet the team nearly went under before the car ever reached Sicily. By late 1954, Connaught was bleeding cash fast. The bills piled up, but the victories did not. Making matters worse, the terrible disaster at that year's Le Mans, the worst tragedy in the history of motorsport, caused a wave of cancellations across Europe. As a result, opportunities to secure prize money quickly dried up. McAlpine, the man whose wallet single-handedly funded the operation, had just married. Suddenly, a risky, expensive racing team became a lot harder to justify. He was genuinely considering whether to close the workshop for good. The romance of British Grand Prix racing was colliding with the cold reality of an empty bank account. Then, an invite arrived from the organizers of the Syracuse Grand Prix, deep in Sicily, and it came with one highly tempting detail: generous start money paid just for showing up. For a team this broke, that cash was reason enough to load the transporter. It was a gamble born of sheer desperation, not ambition. show up, collect the prize money, keep the garage lights on a bit longer, and worry about tomorrow when it came. They prepped 2 cars and headed south. There was only one tiny detail they had completely overlooked. They did not actually have a second driver booked for the trip. One seat went to a fast Formula 3 racer named Les Leston. The other seat, the seat that would truly matter, went to a driver almost no one in motorsport had ever heard of. Number 7. Just reaching the track was an ordeal straight out of a comedy routine. This was no wealthy factory squad rolling into Sicily with a fleet of shiny haulers. Connaught could barely afford to make the trip at all, and it showed across every single mile. The mechanics crammed their cars and gear into a pair of old buses and began a grueling drive across Europe. One of those buses lost its brakes rolling down the mountains of Calabria, the rugged toe of southern Italy, and limped to the track way behind schedule. The exhausted crew did not roll in until Saturday morning, having already missed the start of the event. Brooks made his own way there, and his journey toward one of the most legendary wins in British motorsport history meant hopping between 3 different prop planes over the course of a day. And here is the tiny detail that tells you everything about the driver. He spent that shaky, rattling trip buried in his textbooks, cramming for his final exams to become a dentist. To him, the Grand Prix was just a distraction. Dentistry was his real career. He was an amateur squeezing a race against the world's best drivers into the gaps between his classes. Win or lose, he had a massive exam waiting back home next week, and he was going to take it. You could not write a less glamorous road to glory if you tried. Number 6. They gave a top-tier Grand Prix car to a part-time driver studying to be a dentist. His name was Tony Brooks. He was 23 years old and right in the middle of finals at his Manchester dental school. Before this moment, his career was limited to sports cars and local club meets, plus one terrifying run at the tragic Le Mans race. He had never even sat inside a Formula 1 car. So Connaught made a move that looked incredibly risky. They threw this dental student into a factory Grand Prix car and sent him to battle the fastest drivers on Earth on an unforgiving high-speed track. And things got even worse once he arrived. Because the team was late and the car was irreplaceable, he got almost no practice on an unfamiliar track. A brutal triangle of public roads walled in on both sides with absolutely zero room for error. So he did the only sensible thing he could. He rode a rented scooter around the track for hours, committing every bend to memory before finally getting a brief run in the actual car with instructions to keep the revs low to save the engine. Nobody in the paddock took him seriously. A student driver with a bankrupt British team had no business racing there. Then he took a car he barely knew around a track he learned on a moped and qualified third right behind the factory Maseratis. Suddenly, the smirks vanished and everyone began watching the green car. But what they did not realize yet was that Brooks was more than just fast. He was incredibly smooth and gentle on his equipment, the rare type of racer who could lead the pack without straining the car. And on a blazing hot afternoon of racing, that gentle touch was going to matter more than anyone could guess. Number 5. The modest British car was hiding a secret weapon that the famous Italian team simply lacked. In terms of sheer horsepower, the Connaught was outclassed from the start. The Maserati 250F was the absolute gold standard of Formula 1. The factory team had a whole fleet of them, and on the long straights, it was no contest. But the Connaught was armed with something the red cars lacked: disc brakes. While the Maseratis relied on old-fashioned drum brakes that overheated and faded under pressure, the Connaught used modern Dunlop discs that grabbed tight lap after lap, never losing their bite. This was revolutionary technology at the time, a British engineering breakthrough that had helped Jaguar conquer Le Mans just 2 years prior. And Connaught had quietly adapted that very same concept for a Grand Prix car. On a tight stop-and-go track like Syracuse, where drivers slammed the brakes at the end of every straightaway, this was not some minor detail. It was the entire game. It meant Brooks could brake much later than the Italians carry momentum deep into each turn and stomp on the pedal late in the race with complete confidence, while the Maserati drivers had to pump their fading drums and back off early just to survive. A small shot from a Surrey village had quietly brought a piece of engineering to Sicily that Italy's most famous factory squad could not match. And the rookie in the cockpit understood lap after lap precisely how to convert that advantage into a lead. This is the detail people often overlook about early British teams. They could not match Italian budgets, and they could not beat them on sheer engine power. So they outsmarted them, instead finding clever advantages in braking, in the handling, the aerodynamics, and all those tiny details that win a grueling race rather than a quick qualifying lap. Syracuse was the first time the public saw that philosophy actually deliver. Real quick before we reach the final stretch of this race story. The data on this channel shows that over 80% of you watching right now are not subscribed. You are coming for the stories. But the algorithm has no incentive to recommend the next one. If you have stayed this long to watch a story about a forgotten green car from the 1950s, you clearly love the forgotten corners of motorsport history that most people skip entirely. Hit subscribe so our next story finds its way to you. Now for the moment you came for, the race itself. Number 4. What followed was a masterpiece that left the crowds in disbelief. Right at the start, the Maseratis pulled away as expected, with Luigi Musso leading the charge, while Brooks, who had never actually practiced a race start in the Formula One car, initially fell back. But he would not stay behind. Lap after lap, the green car reeled them in. He picked off one Maserati, then another, until only Musso stood between him and the lead. Then he grabbed it. On the long straights, the Maserati was faster in a flat-out sprint, pulling alongside and sometimes nudging ahead. But whenever they hit a braking zone, the Connaught's disc brakes allowed Brooks to brake later and launch out of the corner first, instantly clawing the lead back. The lead swapped back and forth, their tires nearly touching. The lap record tumbled repeatedly as they traded blows across more than 240 miles of Sicilian road. But the British car had the edge that mattered. Slowly, patiently, and methodically, Brooks began to pull away. He clocked the fastest lap of the entire race, stretching his lead toward a full minute. By the closing laps, the outcome was no longer in any doubt, and realization rippled through the crowd like an electric current. A British car, yes, in British racing green, was about to win a Grand Prix on Italian soil, defeating the Italian Works team on their own home turf. Legend has it that the flustered race organizers scrambled at the last second to find a recording of the British national anthem because the possibility they would actually need to play, it had never crossed anyone's mind. Brooks crossed the line first with the Maseratis of Musso and Villoresi trailing far behind him. The dental student had beaten every single one of them. He did it without making a single mistake, never once overdriving the car, simply by reading the race better than veterans who had been winning Grand Prix races since before he was even old enough to drive. Number 3, they won the entire race on an engine they expected to explode. Think back to the heart of the Type B, that old 4-cylinder Alta-motor, the backup plan after the promised V8 never showed up. To make an old design from the Formula 2 era competitive against the latest Italian machinery, the Connaught, engineers were forced to tune it way harder than it was ever designed for. They pushed it right to the absolute limit of what it could stand. And then they left it there. By their own admission, the biggest question of the entire weekend was not whether the car had speed. It was whether the engine would survive the race. That single fear dictated everything. It was why the team restricted Brooks' practice laps so heavily. They were terrified of breaking the car before it even turned a wheel, because failing to reach the starting grid meant they would not get any starting money at all, and the entire desperate journey would have been for nothing. So picture the situation as it truly was. A nervous amateur in a car he barely knew was sent to chase the finest works team in Italy across miles and miles of walled Sicilian roads on an aging engine that its own builders quietly expected to blow up at any moment. It never did. It held together lap after lap long enough to carry him straight into the history books. Sometimes the line between a footnote and an immortal legend comes down to nothing but a tired old motor stubbornly refusing to give up. Number 2. The greatest British victory in over 30 years does not officially count. Here is the bitter twist that explains why this triumph faded from memory. Brooks' victory at Syracuse was the first time a British car and a British driver had won a major Grand Prix on the continent since Henry Seagrave did it for Sunbeam way back in 1924. Over 3 decades of British struggle wiped away in a single afternoon. At the time, it made front-page news, a massive national moment for a country starved of racing glory. But there was a catch, and it was brutal. The Syracuse Grand Prix was a non-championship race. It followed full Formula One rules against a real factory team over a grueling distance, but it wasn't a round that counted toward the World Championship. And the official record books, those cold ledgers that historians and statisticians rely on decades later, only track championship results. Look up Connaught's Formula One record today, and right next to Grand Prix victories, you'll find a cold, hard number. 0. The greatest victory the team ever scored, arguably one of the most significant in British motorsport history, has been quietly swept into a footnote sitting just outside the official story. That's why almost nobody remembers it today. The sport's own paperwork simply erased it. The triumph actually happened in front of thousands of fans, but on the page where it belongs, there's nothing. Number 1. That forgotten victory lit a fuse that would ultimately destroy the very people who sparked it. Before Syracuse, the idea that a small, underfunded British team could travel to Europe and defeat a legendary factory squad was pure fantasy. After Syracuse, it was a proven fact, fully documented and impossible to deny. and those paying attention took that lesson and ran with it. Within a few short years, a new wave of small British teams flipped the sport on its head. Vanwall, then Cooper, then Lotus. Each one was a tiny operation compared to the giants of Maranello or Modena, and each one was a giant killer. Brooks himself became the proof. He left Connaught signed with Vanwall and shared the win at the 1957 British Grand Prix, marking the first time a British car won a race that officially counted. He came within a single agonizing step of the world title in 1959, and racing fans remember him today as one of the finest drivers of his generation. The racing dentist who could go wheel to wheel with anyone alive. But the team that sparked this revolution, their money finally ran dry. In 1957, the exact year Brooks was winning for Vanwall, Connaught quietly shut its doors, selling everything at auction. Digging through the leftovers was a young buyer named Bernie Ecclestone, the man who would eventually run all of Formula One. This tiny team from Senn proved it was possible, then ran out of cash before anyone else caught up. They sparked the revolution. The actual explosion happened without them. There is something heartbreakingly perfect about that. The team that proved the old racing establishment could be beaten was ultimately defeated by a much simpler enemy, money. And it happened right when the British racing revolution they started was taking over the world. So the next time you hear that Britain's Formula One dominance started with Vanwall or Cooper or some shiny championship trophy, remember this forgotten green car, a temporary machine with an engine that never materialized, hauled to the track in a broken-down bus and driven by a student who scouted the circuit on a scooter, while terrified the motor would blow at any second. They won a race history books practically ignored. The Connaught Type B did more than just win in Sicily. It showed an entire nation what was suddenly possible, and it deserves to finally be remembered for it. If you want more of these forgotten racing stories, the ones left out of the history books, hit subscribe and I will keep digging them up. I'll see you in the next one.